All right, it looks like everyone is here. I think that we just got the go-ahead to start. Let's call the case of United States versus Carrabassett. My name is Judge Welch. Scoring judges, please look to the two buttons on the lower left of your screen and turn off your audio and video. These should remain off until the trial ends. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants. This means that the only people on the screen right now should be the advocates and me. All right, attorneys, can you please make general appearances and housekeeping before we get started?
Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Mashell Rahimzadeh, and I will be representing the state in today's proceedings.
Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Taylor Rich, and I'm proud to be representing the defendant in this case, Ms. Carrabassett. I'm joined today by my second chair, Abby Branham.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
Your Honor, before we begin, we do have just a few housekeeping matters. The prosecution moves to invoke Rules 603 and 615, which call for the constructive sequestration and swearing in of all witnesses.
Defense, do you have any objection to that?
No objection to either of those, Your Honor.
All right, sequestration will be in place.
With that, Your Honor, the prosecution's ready to go.
From the defense?
Yes, Your Honor, just one thing. I'd like to direct your attention to Stipulation 7. It states that Exhibits 4 through 33 in this case have been pre-admitted. I just wanted to make Your Honor aware of that because I will be referencing exhibits that are pre-admitted throughout trial.
Thank you for reminding me. All right, well, with that, I think that we're ready to proceed with opening statements. Do the people wish to give an opening statement at this point?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, you may proceed whenever you're ready.
Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. A desperate woman made a dangerous choice with deadly consequences. In 2011, this defendant had nothing to her name. She had no property, no money, and no career. But then she met someone who promised to give her everything she ever wanted. Don Clark promised her that if only she married him, he would make her dreams come true. He would build an animal sanctuary that she had always wanted. So that year, the defendant married Mr. Clark. But by 2017, this defendant still had nothing to her name. No property, no money, and no career outside of the one her husband had chosen for her. You'll learn that her husband had broken the promises that he had made. And the defendant soon realized that if only he were out of the picture, she could make all of her own dreams come true. Because if her husband was gone, she would get everything he owned. So that year, the defendant killed Mr. Clark. A desperate woman made a dangerous choice with deadly consequences. And for that choice, the prosecution has charged the defendant with murder. In doing so, we take on a burden. We have to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that this defendant is guilty of murder with malice aforethought. In other words, we have to prove to you that the defendant knowingly killed her husband and intended to do so. We will meet that burden today. Because you'll learn today that this defendant was desperate to convert her husband's zoo business into an animal sanctuary. But as long as he controlled the money, he controlled all of the decisions. So the defendant made a choice. She made a choice that would let her control all of the money, control all of the decisions. See, if her husband disappeared, she would legally be granted the right to control all of his assets, including his business. So she decided to make sure he disappeared. But that choice had deadly consequences. You'll learn that on the night of August 18th, this defendant poisoned her husband with a lethal injection of animal tranquilizer and then drove his body out 200 miles from their home to hide it. A desperate woman made a dangerous choice with deadly consequences. Today, you're going to hear from the lead investigator on the case, the FBI Special Agent, Steph Johnson. Now, Detective Johnson will tell you just how desperate this defendant was to change her situation. He'll tell you how in the month of June 2017, this defendant fought with her husband one last time. And a few weeks later, Mr. Clark had disappeared. Mr. Johnson will also tell you about the dangerous choice that the defendant made. How after her husband's disappearance, a bottle of lethal poison was missing from the defendant's property. And after testing was done, a forensics team found the same material from the crime site on the defendant's shoes. Finally, Detective Johnson will tell you that this defendant knew just how deadly the consequences of her actions would be. When interviewed, this defendant specified that she knew exactly how much of that poison was necessary to kill a human being. According to this defendant, it takes exactly 20 micrograms of that poison. In August of 2017, this defendant was a desperate woman who made a dangerous choice with deadly consequences. And because of her actions, a man is dead. That's why, at the end of today's trial, we'll ask you to find the defendant guilty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, counsel. One more thing before the defense proceeds with their statement, if I could just remind all of our scoring judges to turn their view to speaker view. I apologize. I accidentally forgot to do that. Thank you, Bayla, for sending the reminder in the chat room. All right, defense, do you have any opening statement that you would wish to give at this point?
Yes, Your Honor.
Please proceed whenever you're ready.
There's a lot more to this story than this prosecutor would like you to believe. What if I were to tell you that Mr. Clark was preparing to disappear without notice? What if I were to tell you that there's evidence he was worried about the dangerous international business deals he was involved in? What if I were to tell you that on the night that Mr. Clark disappeared, he had an hour-long phone call from an unknown phone number in Costa Rica? The prosecution is stuck on the wrong story, because this prosecutor just came up here and told you that Carrabassett murdered her husband. But today you'll learn that after a year-long investigation, the FBI couldn't find a murder weapon. Members of the jury, they never even found a body. So if there's no murder weapon and there's no body, why are we here in court today? Well, the evidence will show that the FBI got stuck on a suspect, stuck on a story, before they even knew if there was a crime. The truth is, members of the jury, the prosecution won't be able to prove their case to you today, because the most reasonable explanation for what happened to Mr. Clark, that the evidence actually supports, is that he isn't dead. It's that he fled the country. Today you'll learn about the dangerous international business deals that Mr. Clark was involved in. You'll learn that he even told his attorney exactly what to do in the case that he suddenly disappeared. But that didn't fit into the prosecution's story. Today, you're going to hear from Joe Kwong, a producer for a documentary about Miss Bassett's animal sanctuary. Mr. Kwong will tell you that he actually saw the police ignore evidence that didn't fit into their story. Mr. Kwong will tell you that the police were so focused on Carrabassett that they didn't even interview the people at the animal park that day. You'll learn today that the FBI never even looked for the person Mr. Clark spoke on the phone with right before he disappeared. It's important to remember that even though I'll be presenting you with evidence throughout today's trial, it's not the job of the defense to prove anything, because it's the prosecution that's charged Miss Bassett with murder. And the law says that they carry what's called the burden of proof. That burden rests with the prosecution throughout today's entire trial. It never shifts, it never moves, it never lessens. Today, they have to prove their case to you beyond a reasonable doubt. That means that at any point during this trial, the testimony that you hear causes you to pause, to hesitate, to question the prosecution's story. That, members of the jury, is reasonable doubt. And if at the end of this trial, you're left with even one reason to doubt the prosecution's story, it means that they failed to meet their burden. Members of the jury, today the evidence will show that the FBI was more focused on finding a murder suspect than they ever were on finding a missing person. They want you to think that Miss Bassett was a desperate woman who made a deadly choice to kill, but it was the prosecution that's been desperate for a conviction during the entire investigation. They're stuck on the wrong story. At the end of this trial, you and I will have one more chance to talk about the evidence in this case. I'm going to come back up here and ask you to do the only thing that justice will demand, and find Miss Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, counsel. All right, now, give me 1 second. Before the government calls its first witness, I'll ask everyone to switch to gallery view. That button is in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. This will allow you to see the attorneys and witnesses at the same time. All right, and with that, do the people have a witness to call?
Yes, Your Honor. At this point, the prosecution calls Detective Steph Johnson to the stand.
All right, bailiff, can you swear in our witness, or are we not doing that?
All the witnesses can be constructively sworn, so we can proceed.
Excellent. All right, counsel, please proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Could you please introduce yourself to the court?
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon. My name is Steph Johnson. I'm an agent with the FBI.
Mr. Johnson, what's your exact position with the FBI?
I'm a senior special agent, ma'am, and for the last 5 years, I've been working out of our Jacksonville office.
Detective Johnson, what's your background in criminal investigations?
So I've actually worked more than 100 in criminal cases over the last 18 years working with the FBI. That includes several murders, drug trafficking, organized crime, kidnappings. In fact, this last year, I earned a commendation from the Bureau for my work on a child murder case.
Detective Johnson, how did you become involved in today's case?
I was the lead investigator on the disappearance of Don Clark in August of 2017.
So let's talk about how that investigation began. When did you first start that investigation?
It was on August 25th, 2017, when Miss Carrabassett reported that her husband, Don Clark, had gone missing.
And what day did the defendant specify her husband had gone missing?
Actually, a full week before that. August 18th, she said, was the last day she saw Mr. Clark.
Detective, where did that initial call come from?
It came from the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park. That was Miss Bassett and Mr. Clark's residence, and also a local tourist attraction.
Were you ever able to visit that park?
Yes, ma'am. We went there immediately, and as is standard practice, we searched the facilities, buildings, vehicles, the animal enclosures, everything we could get our hands on in the property.
Now, before we talk about whatever physical evidence you may have come across in this case, I want to ask if you were ever able to track the location of the victim on the night of his disappearance.
We were actually. Miss Bassett pointed us to the victim's van, which was at a local airport, and that van had a GPS tracker.
Ms. Farina, if we could project Exhibit 31 onto the screen. Detective Johnson, do you recognize this as that record of the GPS from that van?
Yes, ma'am.
Does it appear to be a fair and accurate copy of it as you last saw it?
Yes, the header looks completely unchanged.
Now, Detective Johnson, according to this report, where did that van begin and end its journey on August 18th of 2017?
It started at the Elephant Park on the night of August 18th and ended at the Carrabassett International Airport, really on the early morning of August 19th, ma'am.
And did you find any evidence that the van had been parked at any other location?
Yes, ma'am. Actually, the GPS reported that for 40 minutes that night, the van was stationary at Big Gum Swamp.
And were you able to conduct any DNA testing on that van?
Yes, ma'am. We found 6 hairs in the van, and all of them were a more than 1 in 2 billion match to Mr. Clark's. That we can be very confident that it was Mr. Clark's hair we found. We also did fingerprint testing, and that matched to Mr. Clark, the defendant, and also one other employee, Miss Stebbins.
Now, where exactly were you able to find those hairs that matched to Mr. Clark?
They were in the bed of the van, in the trunk.
Were you able to conduct any further forensic testing on that vehicle?
Yes, actually, in the floorboard, we found a particular type of algae. It's not typical evidence for an investigation, but in an area with a swamp, that certainly drew our attention.
And were you able to match that particular type of algae to any other items that you recovered during your investigation?
Yes, we also matched them to a pair of boots and a wheelchair. They matched that algae, and all of those, the floorboard, the boots, and the wheelchair, they matched the algae we sampled from the Big Gum Swamp.
And to be clear, where exactly did you recover those 2 items, the boots and the wheelchair, that had that algae on it?
From the defendant's Elephant Park, she said those were hers.
So let's talk about some other physical evidence that you came across. Did you come across anything else of significance while you were at the defendant's residence?
Yes, ma'am. When we were touring the premises, we found a shed, and inside that shed was a carton of drugs that drew our attention.
And what specific drug was that?
It's a drug called carfentanil. It's an animal tranquilizer.
And would you recognize a data safety sheet about that particular chemical if I showed it to you in court?
Yes, ma'am. I reviewed it.
Ms. Farina, could we have Exhibit 17 already in evidence projected for the court? Detective Johnson, could you read for the members of the jury that highlighted bit in the middle of that sheet?
Sure. It says that carfentanil for humans is fatal if even just 1 milligram is swallowed or injected.
Thank you. Did you find any other evidence while you were on the defendant's residence?
Yes, we actually found a logbook in that shed that told us when and where carfentanil was administered.
Did you consider that piece of evidence to be significant in your investigation?
It was very significant because the logbook, which was meticulously tracked, said there were supposed to be 24 syringes of carfentanil in the shed, and we only found 23. That meant that one was unaccounted for.
And in reviewing that logbook, did you find any evidence that the park usually kept records of when that drug was administered?
Yes, the records were meticulous. Every time one was taken out, a record was made. In fact, the day Mr. Clark went missing around 6 p.m., the report says that all 24 were in place. So over that week, one had gone missing.
And did the defendant ever tell you who had access to that shed full of that drug?
She said it was her missing husband, and 2 employees, so 4 total.
Did you find any evidence that the defendant had familiarity with administering that drug?
Yes, ma'am. She had signed out a couple of times in the logbook saying that she was going to administer it to various elephants.
And did the defendant tell you on the day that you questioned her whether that particular syringe was administered on an animal?
No. When we confronted Miss Bassett on the missing syringe, she doesn't have an explanation for where they went missing.
And did Miss Bassett ever note to you familiarity with how that drug reacted with a human body?
Yeah, she told me of her own volition about the dangerous, deadly consequences. She said all it took to kill someone was exactly 20 micrograms.
Let's talk about some other things that the defendant told you. Were you ever able to hear any statements from the defendant about her relationship with her husband?
I was. When we interviewed her, she talked a lot about that.
And did she ever indicate to you that she had something to gain from her husband's disappearance?
She did. She said that she was constantly frustrated with the way that her husband ran the sanctuary, said she thought it was cruel. Ms. Bassett said every time she talked to Mr. Clark about it, he said, as long as it's my money, we're going to play by my rules.
And did you ever find any evidence that the defendant legally stood to gain from Mr. Clark disappearing?
I did, actually, thanks to Mr. Clark's attorney, Ms. Tuminelli, who sent the Bureau a letter describing her relationship with Mr. Clark legally.
Ms. Farina, could we have Exhibit 4 in evidence projected on the screen? Ms. Farina, could we have that projected? Yes. Detective, could you summarize for the members of the court what this document says would happen if Mr. Clark were to disappear?
Yes, actually, Ms. Tuminelli said that Ms. Bassett specifically requested this clause, that if Mr. Clark ever disappeared, then Ms. Bassett would have completely control over his assets, including all of his money and the animal sanctuary.
Thank you for your time, Detective Johnson. I have no further questions.
Thank you very much. Defense counsel, do you wish to cross-examine at this point?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, please proceed whenever you're ready.
Good morning, Agent Johnson. You just testified that Mr. Clark was murdered by Miss Bassett.
Right, that's what the evidence supports, ma'am.
Well, I want to talk about the evidence that you say supports that. You testified on direct examination about the algae on Miss Bassett's boots that supposedly matched algae from the swamp.
Right. It was a very rare combination of algae. It's almost a signature of the swamp, if you will, the presence of those 2 algae together. So it was a very clear match.
Well, let's talk about the possibility that this dirt came from somewhere else. You know that Miss Bassett owns an animal sanctuary.
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Branham, could you please pull up Exhibit 5 on the screen of the forensic report? This report says that the algae from Miss Bassett's boots could have been there for months.
That's right. The algae sticks on for a while. Actually, algae grows over time in damp, moist areas like swamps and also in the ridges of a boot.
So that's a yes to my question. The algae that you recovered on her boots could have been there for months beforehand.
That's right.
And this report actually says that the algae from Miss Bassett's boots was never compared to the algae or the dirt from her own residence.
That's not exactly right, ma'am.
Well, if I could direct your attention to the highlighted portion of what's on the screen, it reads at the end, we did not test or collect any samples from Big Gum Swamp against any natural substances at the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park.
Well, that's right, ma'am. But if you look up a little earlier in the forensic report, it mentions that we collected dirt from the bottom of the golf carts. Those golf carts drove in the dirt around the elephant park. So when we sampled that dirt, we were sampling the dirt off the elephant park. You're right that we didn't go digging in a water hole to get the sample, but we found an elephant park sample anyway.
You talked on direct examination about how a syringe was missing from the storage facility, correct?
That's right, ma'am.
But I want to be clear for the members of the jury, you don't know how that syringe went missing.
Well, the evidence points to one possibility as much clearer than the others, but we don't have any eyewitness footage or video surveillance footage.
Well, it's a possibility, but you can't tell this jury that it was Miss Bassett who took that syringe.
We're pretty confident it is based on the evidence. But again, you're right that we don't have video or an eyewitness saying they saw Miss Bassett take that syringe specifically.
So that's a no to my question. You can't tell this jury that.
We can be confident of it, ma'am. But again, we don't have footage of it.
And you just got up here and testified about what you think happened to Mr. Clark. But I want to talk about the possibility that he's actually alive. Ms. Branham, could I have you pull up Exhibit 4, the exhibit that opposing counsel pulled up prior? This is an excerpt from a letter that you received from Mr. Clark's attorney during your investigation.
That's right, from Ms. Tuminelli.
Mr. Clark had actually talked to Ms. Tuminelli about a plan for his assets if he ever disappeared.
That's right. Specifically, Miss Bassett had included that clause about what would happen to his assets if he disappeared.
But you're aware that Mr. Clark was fine with that disappearance clause being added in.
Right.
And his lawyer told you that's an unusual thing to plan for.
Right. She said that other than Miss Bassett, she wasn't aware of anyone ever having asking for a disappearance clause before. It was pretty unprecedented.
Well, I want to talk about why Mr. Clark may have been making that plan. According to this letter, the reason for this plan had something to do with the men he did business with.
Right. To be clear, that wasn't Mr. Clark's plan. That was Miss Bassett's plan. She's the one who asked for the clause to be included.
Well, you know that Mr. Clark was doing off-the-books business deals with men in Costa Rica.
Right. He apparently wanted to buy either a plot of land or a property off the books. We weren't sure what that meant. Didn't find any evidence pointing to that.
Ms. Branham, could you pull up Exhibit 21, Mr. Clark's phone records? This is Mr. Clark's phone records that you relied on during your investigation.
That's right.
These records show that at 6 p.m. on the night he disappeared, Mr. Clark called someone in Costa Rica.
That's right.
That phone call lasted for almost an hour.
Yes, ma'am. 52 minutes.
That was the last phone call that Mr. Clark made the night he disappeared.
That was the last phone call he made. Yes, ma'am.
Let's talk about the possibility that this phone call had something to do with his disappearance. You know that Mr. Clark regularly travels to Costa Rica.
That's right. Much to Miss Bassett's protestations is my understanding.
You found Mr. Clark's car at the airport.
The van at the airport, yes, ma'am. And the plane was still right there in the hangar.
You know that Mr. Clark lost cell service the night that he disappeared.
That's right.
You know that can happen when someone turns their phone on airplane mode.
Right. If the SIM card is destroyed, if the phone is turned off, if it's put on airplane mode, any of those would explain it.
Agent Johnson, your investigation into this case lasted for a year.
A little bit over a year. Yes, ma'am.
In that entire year, you never found Mr. Clark's phone.
No, ma'am.
You never found his wallet.
No, ma'am.
You never found his keys.
No, ma'am.
But the story that you're sticking with is that Mr. Clark was murdered by Miss Bassett.
Right. That's what the evidence suggests. It's very, very difficult, as you can imagine, to conduct search and rescue in a swamp. Things get destroyed pretty easily there. But the balance of the evidence suggests overwhelmingly that Miss Bassett caused the death of her husband.
But you didn't find evidence of a murder weapon in this case.
We did, ma'am.
You located a murder weapon that was used to inject Mr. Clark with elephant tranquilizer?
Ma'am, you asked if we found evidence of the murder weapon. We did. One syringe went missing that week. Miss Bassett was intimately aware of the effects of that syringe. Miss Bassett was the last person at the park the day the syringe went missing. Miss Bassett's the owner of the park. and Miss Bassett understood that just a few drops could kill someone.
Agent Johnson, I'm going to use your own words here. The syringe was missing.
Right, ma'am.
You never located it.
Right, again, very, very difficult to run search and rescue in a swamp.
You never found any signs of a struggle.
Well, we didn't find the body, ma'am, so we can't tell if there was a sign of struggle.
That's right. You're sitting here testifying in a murder trial when you never even found a body.
Objection asked and answered.
Your Honor, I have not asked this witness the specific question about the body not being found yet.
I would tend to agree. Objection overruled.
Yes, Your Honor. Agent Johnson, you're sitting here testifying in a murder trial when you never found a body.
That's right, ma'am. That's actually not all that rare. Over the last 18 years, I've testified in more than my fair share of cases. And sometimes the body is hidden, disposed of, destroyed. A prosecution still happened if there's enough evidence around it. And in this case, we found that there was. Certainly enough to charge Miss Bassett with murder.
That's a yes to my question. You never found a body.
Yes, ma'am.
I have nothing further for this witness.
Thank you very much. Any redirect from the prosecution?
There is no redirect, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you very much, Agent. You may be excused.
Thank you, Your Honor.
No problem. Have a nice day. People, do you have any other witnesses you wish to call or any other evidence you wish to present?
No, Your Honor. At this point, the prosecution rests its case in chief.
All right. Defense, now the ball's been passed to you. Do you have any witnesses that you would like to call?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Joe Kwong to the stand.
And by the way, if either party have a motion at this point before we start examination, please speak now.
No motions from the defense.
None
All
here.
right. Defense, you may proceed.
Good morning. Please introduce yourself for the jury.
Good morning. My name is Joe Kwong.
What do you do for a living, Mr. Kwong?
So I'm actually a TV producer. You might know me from some of my more famous shows, Flamingo NASCAR, Pilford the Big Red Pig, and Duck, Duck, Moose. Fortunately, due to coronavirus, it has been a little bit tough trying to find people to film. So I'm actually starting a new show, Joe Kwong and the Fish, coming out soon.
How are you involved in this case?
So I'm actually the producer for Carrabassett's new film, Elephant Queen. I'm the person that films the things, puts them all together, gathers footages, that type of stuff.
When did you first meet Miss Carrabassett?
So because she was so impressed with my work, she actually put me on in August of 2015.
What was the nature of your relationship with Miss Bassett?
Strictly professional. I keep my business, personal things separate. So I was there strictly to film the documentary and do what she paid me for.
Did you know Miss Bassett's husband, Don Clark?
Yeah, he wasn't around as much as Carrabassett, but he was always in Costa Rica, coming back and forth. But I spent a fairly good amount of time with him.
I want to turn your attention to why we're in court today. Were you at the Elephant Park on August 18th, 2017?
God, when am I not at the Elephant Park? I'm there 5 days a week. I'm tired of elephants at this point. But yeah, I was there that day.
What were you doing at the park that day?
Just filming, what I'm paid for.
Did you see her husband, Don Clark, that day?
I did. So the last time that I actually saw Don Clark was around 6 o'clock that day.
And how was Carrabassett acting that day?
To be honest, completely normal. She was feeding her elephants. We're doing a little bit about her in the swimming pool. She seemed really, really happy, like usual.
Did you ever speak to Don Clark that day?
Yes, I did. We were actually talking about my Mexico trip that I was coming to. He's giving me some food recommendations.
How did your conversation with Mr. Clark end?
So, it was the normal, hey, how are you? I'm doing well. But then around halfway through, he got a ping from his phone, and then his face just turned white. And he said he needed to go take care of this. And then he left.
Did you ever see him again?
No.
Mr. Kwong, I just want to be clear. Did you see Carrabassett and her husband fighting at all on August 18th?
On August 18th, they certainly weren't angry at each other. It didn't make it seem to be.
Objection, speculation.
May I respond?
Yes, please.
This witness is testifying to his rationally based perception and the observations that he had while he was at the Elephant Park all day on August 18th. He can testify that they didn't seem angry with each other because he didn't directly see them arguing or fighting.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
Yes, your response?
The witness's exact words were that the two were not angry at one another. At this point, we haven't heard any foundation for his viewing of interactions between the two on the day of, that he was able to observe how they were acting with one another. And without that foundation, this testimony is speculative.
I believe what the witness said is they weren't angry at each other. At least they didn't seem to be. And because of that, I tend to agree that it is his rationally based perception. I'm going to overrule the objection. Please proceed.
Yes, Your Honor.
I'll just ask that question one more time. Did you see Carrabassett and her husband fighting on August 18th?
No, I didn't see them fighting. It didn't seem that they were angry with each other. They were smiling. They were happy. It seemed like they were happy.
Were you ever contacted by the police about Mr. Clark's disappearance?
I was. Honestly, it's a little exciting. It's like an NCIS episode.
Did the police ask you any questions about what you knew?
To be honest, I thought they'd ask me a little bit more, but they barely asked me any questions. No.
Did you ever see the FBI interview any of the park staff members?
So I saw them interview some, but not all of the park staff members, specifically Stebbins and Garson. They were both employees at the park. I never saw them get questioned by the police at all.
Did you ever have any other interactions with the police in this case?
Yes, I was actually there when they were searching. I was filming a little bit for the TV show Elephant Queen. I thought it'd be some good content.
Did you notice anything about the way the police were collecting and handling evidence while they were at the park?
I did. So listen, I'm an expert in TV production, not an expert in evidence handling, whatever it is. But they weren't using gloves. And by the amount of NCIS I've seen, pretty sure you're supposed to wear gloves. I mean, I use gloves with my camera. And that's, hopefully it's not crime scene stuff. But
Did you see the officers mishandling any specific evidence?
yeah, so I saw them touching, it's like elephant tranquilizer. I saw them touching that without gloves.
Do you know of the story that the FBI is telling about what happened to Dawn Clark?
So I do. I know that the FBI is saying that Carrabassett killed her husband. Honestly, I don't really believe it, but the entrepreneur I am.
Your response, counsel?
Your Honor, what specific statement is opposing counsel objecting to?
Your Honor, I'm objecting to the witness testifying. He doesn't believe Carrabassett is responsible for her husband's murder.
Your response, defense?
The witness is able to testify to his opinion on the matter. We're about to move on, Your Honor.
I believe that the answer that was given so far is irrelevant. It's also an improper opinion, and so I'm going to sustain the objection and move to strike the answer thus far.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Kwong, without inserting your own opinion on what happened to Mr. Clark, do you know what the FBI is alleging happened to him?
Yes, I do. I know that the FBI is alleging that Carrabassett killed her husband, but I decided to do my own research because I've actually found evidence that he isn't dead.
Objection, speculation.
Your Honor, the witness is about to go into a trip. He's about to discuss a trip that he made to Costa Rica, and he's going to discuss evidence that he has seen firsthand that forms the rationally based perception for that opinion.
Your Honor, in that case, may I amend my objection to improper opinion?
Your response to an improper opinion objection?
Your Honor, the witness isn't making any professional opinion in this case. Like he stated, he's not an expert in evidence. He's not a police officer. He's a TV producer, and he's able to provide his lay opinion from his rationally based perception when he went to Costa Rica and saw evidence firsthand. He's able to provide his lay opinion as to what that means.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes, one more time.
This opinion is not a lay opinion. As the defense counsel has stated, over and over, this witness has testified that he's not an expert in investigations. He's not an expert in evidence. So for this witness to offer an opinion in a criminal investigation to the jury that this victim may have been alive, that he found evidence of doing so, is an improper opinion. He's not a trained authority on the matter. He's not a police officer. He simply cannot make that opinion.
Thank you very much for those arguments. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to refrain from ruling until we see where this questioning leads us. And to the prosecution, after the questioning in this area has been completed, please feel free to re-raise your objection. I just want to get a better sense of exactly what kind of opinions and testimony will be elicited from this line of questioning.
Yes, Your Honor.
Please
Yes,
proceed.
Your Honor. Mr. Kwong, you mentioned that you did research into Mr. Clark's disappearance. What research did you do?
So I actually went to his house in Costa Rica. It's kind of where Glacy gets the cars for the NASCAR races with the flamingos. So I've been there before, and I went back to that area.
Oh, when did you go there?
June 2018. So around a year after he disappeared.
What did you find when you went to Costa Rica?
So what I did is I actually talked to locals in the area, and I showed them a picture of Don Clark. Not a lot of 6'5" people in Costa Rica. And they all instantly recognized him.
Your response, counsel?
Is she objecting to the fact that there's not a lot of 6'5" people in Costa Rica?
Yes.
We're fine with redacting that statement from the record and just allowing the witness to move on with his answer.
All right, that particular portion will be stricken. Please proceed with your answer.
Mr. Kwong, what did you find when you took your trip to Costa Rica?
Yeah, so I went to Costa Rica. I talked to some of the peoples around the area, and I showed them a picture of Don Clark, and they instantly recognized him. But they wouldn't really give me any details past that.
Did you ever take a trip to Don Clark's house in Costa Rica?
I did.
What did you find there?
So I went inside to check the place out, and, it was really weird because the place was spotless. It's like, when things sit for a little while, there's dust, but the place didn't have a speck of dust in it. There were still some clothes there that are Don Clark's, and then there was a fan that was on.
Did the police ever ask you about the information that you found in Costa Rica?
No, they never contacted me again after the first time that we talked.
Your Honor, at this point, I'd like to re-raise my objection to an improper opinion.
Can you explain further?
Yes, Your Honor. At the beginning of his testimony, this witness stated, "I found evidence that Don Clark was in Costa Rica." Now, we've heard the witness testify that he went to his house, he saw a fan on, he saw some clothes hanging in a closet. At this point, he hasn't provided anything under 702, his methodology, the data that he received, his credentials to make this kind of claim. And without that, it's an improper opinion.
Defense, your response.
Yes, Your Honor. This witness is not making an expert opinion on his matter. He's testifying to the direct observations that he observed when he went to the house in Costa Rica. How the fan was on, there was no dust, even though no one had apparently been in the apartment for a year. He's able to use those direct observations to form a rationally based perception as a layperson that he could still be alive.
May I respond to that, Your Honor?
Yes, one more time.
The opinion that this witness gave is not a lay opinion. This is a criminal case. He's speaking on a criminal investigation, and his testimony is evidence that the victim was alive in Costa Rica. That's not an opinion that he's qualified to make. And if defense counsel is adamant that this is not an expert opinion, at this point, it's substantially more prejudicial than probative for the jury to hear that from this witness.
I'm going to overrule the objection. I think this is ripe grounds for cross-examination. However, I am going to let it in just because I do believe that some of what he testified to is a lay opinion and might support what he said earlier about his opinion about him being in Costa Rica. Please proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Kwong, How long have you been filming at the Elephant Park for your documentary?
So I've been filming at the Bassetts from August of 2015 to September 2018. So I filmed them for about 3 years.
Have the police ever asked you for any of that documentary footage during the course of their investigation?
No, they never asked me for any of that footage. No.
I have nothing further for this witness.
All right, cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
Please do.
Mr. Kwong, I want to talk about some things that you just mentioned on direct examination.
Sounds good.
You spoke about your trip to Costa Rica,
That's correct.
right? And you testified that you had gone to Costa Rica because you were looking for evidence that Don Clark was alive.
And the beaches are nice too. But yes, that was one of the reasons that I went.
You'd agree with me that was your main reason for going.
I would say so.
And when you visited his property in Hermosa Beach, you testified that you saw some of his clothes hanging in a window.
That's correct. Yeah,
And you saw a fan on.
I did.
Mr. Kwong, I want to be very clear for the members of the jury. In the entire week that you observed that house, you never saw a single person enter it.
That's right. Yeah,
You never saw a single person leave that house.
that's right.
Now, you noticed that no one was home,
Yeah, while I was in there.
right? The fridge light was off.
Yeah, I think so.
You couldn't see any toiletries in the house.
No, I wasn't looking for any toilet paper stockpiles.
Right? And there were no lights on in the house.
No lights that I could see.
Okay, so let's talk about your relationship to the defendant in this case.
Okay.
You testified on direct examination that you're familiar with the defendant because you used to work for her.
Yeah, following her around for 5 days a week for 3 years. I think I know it pretty well.
But to be clear, Mr. Kwong, you actually still stand to profit from your relationship with the defendant as you testify on the stand today.
I don't know what you mean by that.
Well, let's talk about how many times this defendant has paid you or promised to pay you in the past 4 years.
Okay.
You were employed by the defendant from 2015 to 2018.
Yes, I was. Yeah, for about 3 years.
And for those 3 years, you were paid $5,000 a month.
That's the price for top quality work.
In your own words, the defendant was very generous to you.
She was, yeah.
And after you stopped working for the defendant, well, you still had a financial agreement with her.
Yeah, so if the documentary ever went live, I'd make 20% off of it.
And so she made a verbal promise to you that you would receive 20% of the profits from that documentary.
That's right. Yeah, one of the reasons that I signed on. I knew it had potential.
And to be clear, that was a verbal promise.
Yeah, it was. I trusted her though. So.
Because Mr. Kwong, Miss Bassett is the one who has rights to that documentary.
I'm not a lawyer. I couldn't really tell you the legal jargon, but I mean, it's about her, so I guess so.
You sold that documentary to her.
I don't know. I didn't sell a documentary to her. What do you mean?
You didn't work on that documentary with her for 3 years?
No, I did, but I didn't sell her the documentary, but I did work with her on the documentary.
Okay, Mr. Kwong. And you are aware that at this point, a streaming service has offered $10 million for that documentary.
Those are the people that want to buy the documentary. Yeah.
And 20% of 10 million is $2 million.
Yeah, it's a lot of money.
And as you sit on the stand today, you're testifying on behalf of the defendant who promised you that $2 million.
Yeah, that was our agreement.
Now, when you started working for Miss Bassett, she told you that one day the zoo she ran would be the biggest animal sanctuary.
Yeah, she was really ambitious.
And in the 2 years that you first started working there, it was not a sanctuary.
No, it was more of a zoo type environment.
Right? And that upset the defendant, right?
I know that she wanted a sanctuary, and it did make her angry at some times. That's right.
Ms. Farina, if we could project Exhibit 36 onto the screen. Mr. Kwong, I'm about to show you a clip that you filmed of the defendant.
Okay.
You'd recognize this clip, right?
I always recognize my own work.
Objection, Your Honor. Facts not in evidence.
Your Honor, I was just getting there.
All right. Well, defense, can you please explain a little bit further? I'm a little bit lost.
Oh, my apologies, Your Honor. Opposing counsel has not laid the foundation for this video to be entered into evidence. So I would ask that before she display it on the screen for the members of the jury to be able to see, I ask that she lay that foundation.
Your Honor, if I may, I asked this witness if he took this video and if he recognizes it, and he said yes.
I'd agree. I think adequate foundation has been laid. I'm going to overrule the objection. Please proceed.
At this point, the prosecution moves to enter Exhibit 36.
Any objection?
No objection.
Ms.
All right.
Farina, my apologies.
Please
Ms.
proceed.
Farina, go ahead, Your Honor.
Please proceed.
Ms. Farina, could we play that clip for the members of the jury?
I'm not sure if I'm the only party having this issue, but I cannot hear the audio being played.
I believe the second chair needs to unmute her microphone. I think that might fix it.
I think that there's also an option to share screen with audio that you can select by the share screen option if you toggle that, and that might solve the problem.
I'm stealing. This is a business, not a charity. As long as it's my money, we'll run it that way. That's what Don said to me. Can you believe that? We'll see how this ends.
My apologies. Can everyone see me?
Yes.
Mr. Thank you.
Oh, you just
Mr.
disappeared.
Kwong. I'm sorry, what was that?
You just disappeared. I cannot see you. Oh, now I can see you. Okay.
Mr. Kwong, you were with the defendant after her husband disappeared.
That's correct. Yeah, we wanted to film a segment to see how things are going without Don Clark.
And just 2 months after her husband disappeared, you saw that zoo transform into a sanctuary,
I did. It was really beautiful.
right? There weren't any cages anymore.
No, they were all free roaming, like myself.
The guests weren't allowed to touch the animals.
That's right.
And the zoo was now a nonprofit sanctuary.
That's my understanding.
I want to talk about your interactions with the defendant and her husband. You actually saw the couple fight a number of times in your 2 years with them.
You couples fight. I'm with them for 3 years. It's bound to happen. So yes, that's right.
In your opinion, I mean, in your own words, when they fought, they would fight about the zoo.
That's correct.
They would fight because the defendant wanted it to be a sanctuary.
Yeah, I did overhear that in an argument. Yeah.
And you heard them fight about this same issue over and over in the course of those 2 years.
Yeah, I did.
And you actually witnessed one fight that stuck out to you in the summer of 2017.
That's correct. Yeah,
This time they were fighting about the sanctuary again.
they were.
But this time the defendant became particularly angry.
Yes, she seemed upset.
This time she threw a vase at her husband's head.
Yeah, it was an elephant vase, and that's the second time I see an elephant's fly. So
And that was the last time that you saw the two of them fight about that zoo before Mr. Clark disappeared.
yeah, so that incident a year before he disappeared, that was the last time. Correct.
Thank you for your time. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. we're fine with the witness stepping down.
All right, sir, you may be excused. Thank you very much. Defense, do you have anything further?
No further witnesses or no further motions from the defense. We're ready to proceed with closing arguments.
Excellent. We will now hear closing arguments from each party. Everyone should please switch back to the speaker view, which is located in the top right-hand corner. Also, since both witnesses have completed their testimony, you can now complete the witness portion of your ballot. So what I'll do is I'll give around 2 minutes, and then we will proceed with closing statements. So a very short recess at this point in time. Excellent. And now, do either party have anything that they wish to address prior to closing arguments?
Not at this point, Your Honor.
No, Your Honor.
All right. Does the prosecution wish to give a closing argument?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
Please do.
Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. A desperate woman made a dangerous choice with deadly consequences. In August of 2017, this defendant was desperate to turn her life around. For 6 years, she had been trapped in a marriage with a husband who was unwilling to listen or to give her what she wanted. For years, she begged and pleaded with him to turn his business into an animal sanctuary. She begged and pleaded, and he wouldn't listen. And finally, in May of 2017, she had a better option for how to make that happen. So she made the choice that would give her what she wanted. She made sure her husband disappeared so she could have control of that business. And you heard about the deadly consequences that came with that choice. Because the dose of poison that the defendant gave her husband was lethal. And on that night, after she drove 200 miles out to a swamp in the middle of nowhere and left the body of her partner of 7 years in a swamp, this defendant took his car to the airport and parked it there to make it look like he disappeared. A desperate woman made a dangerous choice with deadly consequences. Now, as the prosecution, we had the burden of proof today. We had to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of the murder of her husband with malice aforethought. We had to prove to you that the defendant killed her husband and that she did so deliberately. We've met that burden today. Because the first thing that we had to show you was that Don Clark was killed that day. And you're going to hear from the defense in a second. They'll come up here and they'll try to convince you that you didn't hear that. They'll try to confuse what you heard. They'll try to interpret it as something that it wasn't. So I want to make it very clear. To meet our burden today, to prove that Don Clark was killed, the prosecution didn't have to bring you any eyewitnesses that happened. We didn't have to bring you any direct evidence of a murder. We just had to bring you evidence that only led to that one conclusion. That only one reasonable conclusion: Don Clark was killed in August of 2017. And every piece of evidence that you heard today leads you to that one conclusion. Because you heard about the forensic and DNA testing that draw that conclusion. You heard that in the back of Mr. Clark's car on August 18th, they found his hair. And I want you to pay close attention to that, members of the jury. Of all the places in Mr. Clark's car, the FBI only found those hairs in his trunk. Now, if Mr. Clark was driving that car, if he was planning to get away to Costa Rica like the defense contends, why wasn't his hair in the front seat? If he'd gotten into that vehicle willingly, why was there none in the passenger side? The only reasonable conclusion for why his hair was in the trunk that night is that he was unwillingly placed there. You also heard about the syringe that was missing from the defendant's home after her husband went missing. Now again, the defense will come before you and they'll tell you, we don't have that syringe, we don't have that weapon, but members of the jury, you heard who had access to that drug. 4 people. And only 2 of them were at the residence that night. Don Clark and the defendant. The only reasonable conclusion is that Don Clark was killed that night. And we know the defendant did it. Because you heard her own statements today. You heard from the defense's witness that year after year, the defendant fought with her husband for control of that business. She wanted to make different decisions and he wouldn't let her, until finally, she found a loophole. You saw the letter from Mr. Clark's attorney today that said in May of 2017, he granted her access over all of his assets, including his business, in the event that he disappeared. Members of the jury, we have the evidence that after Mr. Clark disappeared, the defendant did take control of that business. She did change it into exactly what she said she would. But members of the jury, members of the jury, you also heard from Detective Johnson, who told you about the dangerous choice that this defendant was desperate to make that day. How when they conducted forensic testing of her residence, they found an exact match of the crime scene to the defendant's boots, ones that she admitted she owned. There is only one reasonable conclusion for what happened on August 18th of 2017. And it's not that Mr. Clark fled the country to Costa Rica. There was exactly one person at the residence that night with him, exactly one person who had access to the chemical that was injected into his body, exactly one person who wanted Don Clark to disappear. That was the defendant. A desperate woman made a dangerous choice with deadly consequences. Find her guilty.
Thank you very much, counsel. Defense, do you wish to give a closing statement at this time?
Yes, Your Honor.
Please proceed whenever you're ready.
The prosecution just stood up here and asked you to convict Carrabassett for the death of her husband. With a request like that, with the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt resting on Ms. Rahimzadeh's shoulders, I would expect her to provide you with certainty. Instead, she provided you with assumptions. You see, what the government is desperately hoping you won't notice is that in order to believe their case, you have to make one key assumption. They're asking you to assume that Mr. Clark is actually dead. But when you take that assumption away, their case falls apart. When you take that assumption away, it becomes clear that the prosecution is stuck on the wrong story. So let's stop making assumptions and start looking at the evidence, because it seems like that's something the prosecution has been failing to do in this case. Today, we showed you a letter from Mr. Clark's attorney that was addressed to Agent Johnson, the lead investigator in this case that you heard from today. In this letter, she tells him that Mr. Clark was planning for a sudden disappearance months before August 2017. Members of the jury, you're probably thinking that it's pretty unusual for someone to be planning with their attorney what to do if they mysteriously disappear. That's because it is pretty unusual. Mr. Clark's attorney told Agent Johnson the reason he was worried about having to mysteriously disappear is because of those men in Costa Rica that he was dealing with. He told his attorney he was doing off-the-books business deals with international organizations in Costa Rica. And we know that these were not normal business deals. Because you don't start planning on what to do in the event of your sudden disappearance unless the people that you're dealing with are dangerous. And it's not a coincidence that Mr. Clark disappeared the same night he had a 1-hour phone call with a number from Costa Rica. And that's something that the prosecution has failed to even mention at all. When Agent Johnson took the witness stand, you didn't hear a single thing about the FBI looking into who was on the other end of that call. The last call Mr. Clark made before he disappeared. Who called him? Oh, what did they talk about for 52 minutes? Why did Joe Kwong testify that he saw Mr. Clark's face go white and say, I need to go deal with this, right before he called that person? And the most important question of all to ask yourselves, members of the jury, why can't the prosecution give us any of those answers? That's because the truth is, the FBI was more focused on looking into Carrabassett than they ever were on looking for Mr. Clark. Mr. Clark told people he was afraid of the men that he was dealing with in Costa Rica. He told his attorney he might have to disappear. And when his attorney tells that to the lead investigator in this case, they don't even factor that into their investigation. And members of the jury, that is a gaping hole in the prosecution story. And that is reasonable doubt. The prosecution is saying that they have proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Clark is dead and that Carrabassett was the one who murdered him. But members of the jury, if they haven't shown you a murder weapon with Mr. Clark's DNA on it, they weren't even able to show you a murder weapon at all. They have absolutely no proof that a syringe ever came into contact with Mr. Clark, and they're trying to fill that hole in their story by blaming Miss Bassett for their lack of evidence. They want you to assume there's no murder weapon because Miss Bassett took it and hid it somewhere, when the evidence never shows that. That's just another assumption that the prosecution is asking you to make. In fact, what the evidence actually shows is that it was the FBI agents who were seen reprimanded for mishandling those syringes throughout their investigation. How do we know they weren't the ones who lost that syringe? We don't, members of the jury. Not only was, just like they can't prove that Mr. Clark's body was ever at that swamp, they can't prove that Miss Bassett was ever there either. You see, if you actually look at the report that supposedly ties the algae from the swamp to Miss Bassett's shoes, it says right there that it's not certain that that algae is from that specific swamp. It states that they never cross-referenced that algae from that swamp with any dirt or algae from the elephant park that Miss Bassett worked at every day. They didn't even check to see if the contents were similar. It's just another instance of the police sticking to their own story instead of following the story that the evidence was telling. Now, when you look at the prosecution's case, it doesn't look so certain. In fact, it's based on a lot of assumptions. Members of the jury, the law tells us exactly what we need to do here. The law tells us that when the prosecution starts asking you to make assumptions, there's only one presumption you can make: innocence. The evidence has shown that the prosecution is stuck on the wrong story. So I ask that you deliver a just verdict for Carrabassett, the only verdict that the evidence demands. Find Miss Bassett not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, counsel. Prosecution, do you have any rebuttal that you'd wish to add?
Yes, Your Honor. And before I begin, can I instruct my second chair, Ms. Farina, to present Exhibit 4 already in evidence?
And please proceed whenever you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. And for the record, can everybody see the exhibit at this point?
No, not yet.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
Yes, please.
Now, the defense has over and over tried to convince you that Mr. Clark had a plan to get away on August 18th. They tried to show you evidence for that. But I want to direct you to the same letter that you saw from his attorney today. You can look at it when you go back to deliberate and see that if Mr. Clark had a plan for off-the-books money and what to do with it, he never went through with it because he disappeared before that could ever happen. There are no assumptions left to be made. There was one person on the property with him that night, one person who had access to that drug, and one person with a motive to want him gone. A desperate woman made a dangerous choice with deadly consequences. Find her guilty.
All right. Thank you very much to both parties. You did an excellent job. I'll have another very short recess while everyone submits their ballots.